In 1955, New Haven's final electric locomotive would roll out of General Electric. The EP5 was iconic, but incredibly flawed at the same time. The EP5 would be the most famous of all New Haven electric locomotives, and that's one of the locomotives that I'll be discussing today. So sit back and enjoy this episode about the end of New Haven Electrics. So don't forget to subscribe, as I do videos about all sorts of trains around the world. Next week's episode will be about an interesting EMU, namely the Bud Metroliner. And the week after, we'll be going in depth about German's DB post-war electric locomotive development. To recap, if you haven't watched the previous episode regarding New Haven, was that we recovered about how New Haven set the then American standard of 11 kilovolts, 25 Hz, going into the early box cabs such as the EP1, EF1, EF2, while also going into the inspiration for the GG1, the EP3. So if you do want to learn all about that, I'll have a pinned comment with a link to the video. To begin, we'll first talk about the EP4. As usual, with all other passenger locomotives of the New Haven electric fleet, they would also carry third rail shoes for both top rail and under rail running, allowing it to travel into Grand Central Terminal. The EP4s would arrive in 1938 and would number 361 to 366. It would use a 2C C2 configuration using AC commutator motors and would push out 3,600 horsepower. They would weigh 216 tons, just a bit heavier than the previous EP units. So now let's discuss the EF3. Externally, they're almost identical on the outside to the EP4. However, on the inside, they were more powerful and heavier compared to its passenger sibling. This was because it didn't have to conform to the axle loading requirements of the New York Park Avenue Viaduct. Delivered in 1942 and 43 by General Electric and Baldwin Westinghouse, it would also have a top speed of 65 miles per hour. The continuous horsepower rating was 4,860 horsepower at top speed. However, its short-term power was an incredible 9,100 horsepower, which is nearly double of the GG1. These EF3s would mainly pull freight from Bay Ridge, Long Island, to Cedar Hill. On average, these engines could pull 100 cars. While researching this topic, something I did notice was the sub-designation of A and B. This does not relate to the actual manufacturer. To explain, in 1944, to help with the increase of traffic and need for more passenger locomotives, it drove New Haven to retrofit 5 of these EF3s for dual-purpose roles. The addition of a steam heating boiler allowed them to heat coaches and be used for passenger services. These locomotives were numbered 150 to 154 and classified EF3B, the B designating boiler. However, an important thing to note is due to the lack of a contact shoe for third rail running, the EF3s were not able to run into Grand Central Terminal. The end of the EF3s would come with the McGuinness management, due to the management preferring diesels over electrics. Due to this, the overhead from Bay Ridge to Cedar Hill was pulled down, and with this in 1959, the EF3s had nowhere to run and were retired from service. One thing to note is despite there being models of EF3s in the McGuinness livery, the red, black and New Haven style livery, it's not historically correct, as they did not get repainted into this livery and they would traditionally stay in New Haven green. The EP5 would be delivered in 1955 by General Electric. It would be the first electric passenger locomotive that was fitted with a mercury arc rectifier. To explain, this would convert the AC overhead to DC for the traction motors. Like all previous electric passenger locomotives used by the New Haven, it would be equipped with an AC pantograph and a third rail shoe. However, it would lack a DC pantograph. The EP5 would also be equipped with the Pennsylvania Railroad cab signaling system, allowing it to run to Penn Station. However, their Washington to Boston runs were their main assignment. The EP5 would also be tasked to pull the iconic express known as the Montrealer. The name jet would come from the traction motor blowers. To explain what a traction motor blower is, functionally it's a big fan that will help cool down the motors. However, they were incredibly loud and in some ways weren't enough, as the EP5 has an infamous reputation for catching fire. The EP5 would have a reputation for being unreliable. However, this could be attributed to the maintenance deferment of the McGuinness administration and policy for removal of electric services in the future. This was also further caused by issues of bankruptcy, leading to in 1962, out of the 10 produced, 3 were in service. However, with the new trust leading the New Haven out of bankruptcy, the trust would immediately rebuild them and get them back into service. The EP5 would also be a dual-service locomotive, as it would be used on trailer freight duties during off-peak or during the night. However, its lack of multiple unit working and dynamic brake would soon cause issues during its service at Penn Central. However, I'll explain that further in a Penn Central video. To explain the EF4 means I'll have to explain its origins on the Virginian. The Virginian was quite keen on the electrification, having electrified its routes from Mullins, West Virginia to Roanoke. To replace its older box cab units, it purchased 12 ELCs from GE. These in 1955 were truly state-of-the-art with ignitron rectifiers. These rectifiers were used to convert the AC overhead to the DC used for the traction motors, putting out a respectable 3,300 horsepower over 6 axles. The ELC would serve from 1956 to 1959. However, what would threaten the ELC was the merger of the Virginian and Norfolk Western. Norfolk Western saw no reason to continue electrification, and the overhead was pulled down in 1961. This meant that the ELC had nowhere to run. However, one was converted to a road slug, and the other 11 were sent to a storage. The road slug had poor performance, and the rest of the ELCs were put on for sale. The Norfolk and Western would sell 11 road-going locomotives and the road slug as a parts donor. This purchase would total in cost of $300,000 at the time. So you may ask, why get rid of earlier freight locomotives and rip down wires if they're going to purchase more electric locomotives later on? Simply, the McGuinness administration was incredibly short-sighted. There was an assumption that they would be able to remove electric traction on the New Haven wholly. The fallacy was that the lack of understanding that a fair chunk of New Haven's passenger traffic was a majority electric, using things such as electric-powered commuter cars and things like the EP5 and EP4 earlier. This also meant, with the removal of electric locomotives and push for diesels, that there would be no demand for off-peak power. Think the night time or just non-peak hours. However, with the bankruptcy of 1962, New Haven would be placed into an administration of trustees who would immediately realize this error and course correct with the purchase of the second-hand ELCs. Again, the ex-Virginians would now be renamed from ELC to EF4. The EF4 would serve as a main electric freight engine until the merger with Penn Central. New Haven, from my understanding, would use these engines in pairs, and it would serve for many years reliably, even past the merger of Penn Central and into the Conrail era. However, I'll discuss their service during the Penn Central in a later video. The EF4 is the only electric locomotive to have survived the scrapper's torch that served under New Haven. Illinois Railway Museum currently has one in its original Conrail blue livery, pending restoration, and the Virginian Railroad Museum would have their ELC in a restored Virginian livery. The last locomotive I'll discuss isn't necessarily a pure electric locomotive, but it is at the same time. Introducing the FL9. To explain the FL9 electro-diesel, we have to go into context of why. The FL9 order was part of a new direction the McGuinness administration wanted to go down, the removal of electric traction altogether, the requirements of electric running into New York City, and to remove the change of locomotives at the electric zone. The FL9 itself would be based on the FP9, which itself was based on the F9. The FL9 would be 4 foot longer than the passenger FP9 to accommodate for the equipment such as third rail running into Grand Central Terminal and to accommodate for the larger train heating boiler. The FL9 would have a rare configuration of bow A1A. This meant that the rear truck center axle was unpowered and was there to help spread the weight. All FL9s would have the McGuinness livery on delivery, and uniquely, for a diesel, would feature the Hancock air whistle, which sounds very much like the whistles found on steam locomotives. An order of 60 would take place, and it would be made by New Haven. However, the first 30 would have a small DC pantograph fitted to help them go over turnouts at Grand Central Terminal, and it would also include the EMD 567C. And the last batch of 30 would have the slightly upgraded 567D that produced 1800 horsepower, 50 more than the earlier model. The FL9 would also be, sadly, underpowered for the role. While it may produce 1800 horsepower at the crank, it would realistically only produce closer to 1500 to 1600 for the traction motors. This is a problem, as the FL9 could not match the locomotives it was designed to replace 1-to-1. A single EP5 could put out 4000 horsepower. This meant on larger trains the FL9s would need at least 3 units to match a single EP5. However, the advantage of the FL9 was that it could run all the way to Boston without requiring an engine change. This allowed the FL9 to pull the Merchant Limited from South Station to Grand Central Terminal within 4 hours and 15 minutes. However, the dream for the New Haven would have been to electrify all the way to Boston. However, the bankruptcies and poor financial management of the railroad meant that this electrification would only be done much later and under a different railroad. This would only be completed under Amtrak in January 31st, 2000 for the Northeast High-Speed Rail Improvement Program. One requirement the FL9 was that it had to be lightweight, and due to the axle loading requirements at New York Park Avenue Viaduct, this requirement resulted in the A1 truck and the rear. This also indicates why it was called the FL9. The L stands for lightweight. The introduction of the FL9 would kill off nearly all New Haven's electric fleet. The only locomotive to survive was the EP5s and later on the purchase of the EF4s. Despite the main intention to be a passenger locomotive, the FL9 would also find itself used on freight services, especially between Cedar Hill Yard, New Haven, and Oak Point in the Bronx. Despite the intentions of abandoning electrification, it would never happen on the New Haven route, cancelling out one of the main reasons for the purchase of FL9s. However, uniquely, the FL9 would have an amazing claim to fame. It would appear in a Christopher Reeves Superman movie. See FL9 future service in a future video, and its transfer to other state-owned railroads such as the MTA and the CDT, so you may wonder what happens to the FL9. Despite its flaws, it would actually serve for many decades to come, and was only retired relatively recently. The last FL9 to run for a transport agency was in 2009. This meant that a lot of FL9s still survive either as display units or currently operational. A fair few operate for smaller heritage railroads, and if you are keen to see one, the Danbury Railroad Museum has 2, and one in a surprising New York Central scheme, which never happened in real life. So what do I think of the New Haven electric locomotives? Quite simply, I love them. I genuinely wish that they got the recognition that they deserve. I think it's a massive shame that none were preserved and has been kind of actually ignored in the modelling world until recently. I currently have a Rapido EP5 and it's simply amazing. It has the pantographs go up and down. Very, very cool. However, it's actually quite hard to find matching coaches just because they're quite rare to find, and generally New Haven modelers just going to snap it up. However, there has been rumours of further New Haven electrics coming out. There are rumours that Rapido may be doing ELCs, the EF4 or E33, depends on what you want to call them. I do hope that's true. I'd love to see one, especially in either the Virginian or the New Haven scheme personally. I find the Penn Central one quite boring personally, but I'm pretty sure a lot of people would actually agree with that. So, if I have forgotten anything, do add it into the comments below. I love hearing back your feedback, and just even hearing stuff about the stories that, as a kid that you saw New Haven EP5s flying around. Honestly, it's very cool hearing about all the stories, or even just the facts I have missed. I love listening to feedback and just these stories. And thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe if you did enjoy this video, and don't forget to like. I just want to say thank you to you, my viewer, and a thank you to my partner. Hope you enjoyed this video, and you have a good night.